This may be one of the most pessimistic tone videos I will ever make. I think we should embrace this pessimism, embrace the hopelessness, not just of that in this video, but in our current predicament. We live in the world after 20th century socialism, after the left failed in their attempt to establish the world dreamed of, failed to grab a hold, and failed what seemed to be its end. What do we do now? A new revolution? Reformism? Give up and let capitalism accelerate itself to its end? Where do we go from here? We have crisis all around us. The need for this future couldn't be more urgent. With the rise of a neo-feudalist future, the privatization of the very commonplaces where exploitation takes place, climate change threatening to end us all, and the rise of geopolitical tensions creating strong divisions in our shared humanity, where do we go? Hope for this more egalitarian future remains within leftist circles, from the anarchist all the way to the Stalinist. But what if this hope is the very thing keeping us constipated and barring us from achieving this future? In Courage of Hopelessness by Slavoj Žižek, he elaborates on this with a story of a man named Zeno, who wishes to stop smoking. Zeno attempts to stop, saying this will be his last cigarette, and because it is his last cigarette and he truly believes it to be so, he enjoys it at a surplus. However, of course, he fails and does it all again, enjoying his new last cigarette at a surplus. This surplus continues the cycle, as now he gains enjoyment by convincing himself it'll be his last, making each smoke better than what they were before. So what does Zeno do to break out of this cycle? Zeno removes the prohibition, allowing himself to smoke as much as he wishes, thinking the obsession with smoking is because of his passion to stop. The results are horrible. Instead of feeling free to smoke or not to without the prohibition, he now smokes all the time, but is filled with guilt, knowing he wants to stop. This brings Zeno to despair. Everything he tries fails. There's no way out, no pleasurable compromise. In this total despair, there is no enjoyment from the smoking, no narcissistic satisfaction. Everything loses sense. Smoking loses its sense. There's no point to it. So, in total despair, not as a great decision, he stops smoking. The way out thus emerges unexpectedly when Zeno accepts the total hopelessness of his predicament. And this same matrix should also be applied to the prospect of radical change. There is a radical politics lurking in the hopelessness of our predicament. The embracing of this hopelessness may lay the foundation that this politics can rise from. In this story of the smoker, we can see the approaches of different radical leftists. The first instance of this we can see in a statement by George Orwell, who writes, "We all rail against class distinctions, but very few people seriously want to abolish them. Here you come upon the important fact that every revolutionary opinion draws part of its strength from a secret conviction that nothing can be changed." Orwell is pointing to the fact that radicals invoke revolutionary change in order to achieve its opposite, to prevent the change from ever occurring. This reflects the smoker when he is convinced he can stop smoking when he chooses. the very possibility of change is used to guarantee it will not be acted upon, to forever enjoy the surplus of not changing, but standing against the status quo. The next reflection we can find in this story is that of the accelerationist, to remove the prohibitions, to let capital run free. A belief that capitalism will fall because of its overdevelopment, so we must engage in capitalism to its end. As we can see, the suffering under capitalism, its violence, if accelerated, would only become worse, making us feel as the smoker did when he removed the prohibitions on his smoking. It is only when we despair and don't know anymore what to do that change can be enacted. We have to go through this 0 point of hopelessness. We've seen the price to be paid for an attempt to live up to hope. In the Soviet Union, under Stalin, he believed there was a historically unique chance to build socialism in one country. In this situation, the formula presented was one of hope. However, we saw purges, mass starvation, and the unneeded loss of human life. The lesson of 20th century communism is that we have to gather the strength to fully assume the hopelessness. Today, even when we are drowning in pessimism, we still give ourselves a hint of there being light at the end of the tunnel. Even in our pessimism, hope still exists. We refuse to be courageous. We decide to be naive about our situation, to not take seriously the weight of our predicament. The true courage is not to imagine an alternative, but to accept the consequences of the fact that there is no clearly discernible alternative. The dream of an alternative is a sign of a theoretical cowardice, functioning as a fetish that prevents us from thinking through to the end of the deadlock of our predicament. In short, the true courage is to admit that the light at the end of the tunnel is probably the headlight of another train approaching us from the opposite direction. Žižek says this approaching train takes on many forms. Given that the troubles within global capitalism have exploded at 4 levels, the 4 levels being that of the rise of fundamentalist terrorism, geopolitical tension with and between non-European countries. This is even more obvious in the light of the conflict in Ukraine. New radical emancipatory movements throughout Europe, and the number of refugees from conflicts. It is crucial to see these threats and their interconnection, not in the sense that they are the 4 faces of the same enemy, but in the sense that they express aspects of the same imminent contradiction of global capitalism. However, Žižek believes there is something keeping us from dealing with these real issues. Instead, we are wrapped up in pseudo-struggles. These pseudo-struggles are struggles that do nothing in terms of bringing real change. Things people will rally for as if they are revolutionary, when in reality both sides in the struggle are far from good, or in the grand scheme, irrelevant. Think of how people get up in arms on social media over an unimportant issue, or to be more precise, the weekly discourse on Twitter. We can also see this reflected in certain elections, where the outcome doesn't really change much of anything, yet we rally as if it's a life or death situation. It's not that we can't prefer one side to the other in these struggles, but that our overall stance should be that of indifference. These issues are relatively unimportant in comparison and block us from the issues we need to truly face. With these pseudo-struggles clouding our view, is there still the potential for true change beneath these pseudo-struggles? There is, since the function of these pseudo-struggles is precisely to block the explosion of the true ones. Why do we not see past the pseudo-struggles? Why do we refuse to take on the real struggles of today? Marxian sociologist Joran Terborn paints our predicament. Never before have the possibilities of a good world for the human species as a whole been greater. At the same time, the gap between human potential and the existing conditions of humankind in its totality has probably never been wider. We simultaneously have the most potential to build the future we need, and the most distance from achieving our potentiality. If this is the case, and our crises are getting higher in number and higher in severity, why this gap? The great paradox of today's situation. There's a growing dissatisfaction with global capitalism that often explodes in rage, but it is less and less possible to articulate this rage into a new leftist political project. If the growing rage gets articulated into a program, it is predominantly in the guise of a rightist populism. We can see this occur within the rhetoric of the rising populist right. Look no further than the figure of Donald Trump. He speaks on draining the swamp of elites, blaming immigrants, foreign countries, and the progressive left for the hardships of working people. He offers a program, even if it is one based on falsities. It is one that speaks to working people. So here we have sentiment that should be anti-capitalist and leftist, funneled to the populist nationalist right. What should the left do here? What is to be done? The danger in this situation isn't as much the passivity of the left, but that of pseudo-activity, the constant urge to be active, to participate in overall pointless actions, those that don't hold weight, such as engaging in pseudo-struggles. The first step for the left should be to fight against this urge. Against such an inner passive mode of our participation in socio-ideological life in which we are active all the time in order to make sure that nothing happens, that nothing really changes. The first truly critical step is to withdraw into passivity, to refuse to participate. This is the necessary first step that, as it were, clears the ground for true activity, for an act that will effectively change the coordinates of the constellation. Instead of engaging in conflicts, whether with family, on social media, or other ways of signaling our virtue, we instead need to pull back. We need to say, I would prefer not to. We need to stop our pseudo-activity, our inner passivity, in order to clear the space for a real leftist program to emerge. This is urgent. The world doesn't pause. The world doesn't stop creating crisis. but instead multiplies them. While we are engaged in our passivity, the world continues to crumble. We could leave it here. This is the hopelessness, the weight of our predicament alongside having no real solutions to these problems. Instead, we are wrapped in our pseudo-struggles. The left does not offer up much of anything in terms of a political program to build our future upon. We don't know where to go. Every turn we make, every light at the end of the tunnel leads us to an oncoming train. However, if we have taken on the weight of this hopelessness, we see the need for a radical change, and we need one urgently. There's plenty of work to be done in terms of creating concrete solutions, but we can make some criteria. That criteria is communism. The task confronting us today is precisely the reinvention of communism, a radical change that moves well beyond some vague notion of social solidarity, insofar as, in the course of the historical process of change, its goal itself should be redefined. We can say that communism is to be reinvented as the name for what emerges as the goal after the failure of socialism. This reinvention of communism is not that of returning to orthodox Marxism, 20th century socialism, or some variation of anarchism. The goal of this communism isn't necessarily to live in a utopic fantasy where struggles cease to exist, but instead is what we find when we embrace the hopelessness. What is necessary for the survival of humanity, the overcoming of capitalist expansionism, wide international cooperation, and solidarity that should lead to the creation of an executive power ready to violate state sovereignty. Are these not all measures destined to protect our natural and cultural commons? If they do not point towards communism, if they do not imply a communist horizon, then the term communism has no meaning at all.